Hey, in this section on environmental hazards, we're going to actually kind of take this one off the books. In other words, this will be your only study guide for this. We will follow this up with some handouts so that you can have some practice questions on this. But environmental hazards are pretty straightforward. I'll go ahead and give you a little bit of clue as we're getting started here. When you're dealing with environmental hazards, always be thinking in terms of, well, what's the health concern? I mean, why is it an environmental hazard to start with? We will also talk a little bit about remediation, and we'll talk about what agents should know. With that in mind, let's take a look real quickly at the objectives in this particular chapter. You explain the licensee's responsibility when environmental hazards are discovered. By this point in the class, hopefully you're getting to understand the concept of a material fact, so this will not be foreign to you. And we will list and define most common environmental hazards. Let's start off with this. A couple of bullet points, 3 bullet points to make to you here. Because this will be tested on the national side, you will often see things leak in that are not North Carolina specific, but more national in scope. One thing that we can all agree on is the first bullet point, that material facts must be disclosed, because if you are aware, or if you reasonably should be aware of an environmental hazard, then clearly it will be treated as a material fact that you would disclose to all parties, not only your client, but also the other clients as well. Broker must disclose even if the seller believes it has been cured or removed. So in North Carolina, we consider ourselves a caveat emptor state. So a seller may say something to this effect. They may say, hey, listen, I had a problem with that fuel tank in the past, but we removed it, we had it remediated, it's no problem now, and maybe they don't disclose it on the property disclosure statement that the seller has to complete. However, for real estate agents, it would still be material. Fortunately, one of the things you'll learn is there are often recorded documents that will speak to this. So there will be a public statement on it that we could just simply pass on. But even if the seller believes it's been cured or removed, if it was an environmental hazard, we should be disclosing it. Must disclose contamination outside of property boundaries as it may impact value. Think simply here. We're not going to become environmental experts in this one chapter, so keep it very, very simple. And here's what I mean by that. If for some reason there were leaking toxins into a waterway, that would be something that anyone that feeds off of that water or whose well works off of that water system would need to have disclosed to them. And I'm in North Carolina, and there's been a couple of notable cases recently from toxins that have been released, chemicals that have been released into waterways in Cumberland County, Chatham County, a couple of areas that are nearby. And they are not on the property itself, but they might impact the property. So we would need to disclose things like that. In some cases, it's not going to be that it's going to be a showstopper. It's that the buyer needs to be aware. So if they need to take any precautions regarding their water filtration or something to that effect. So you must disclose contamination outside of the property boundaries if it may impact the property. Take a look at this comment here. Who do you call? Now, this is getting close to what a question might look like on the exam. Oftentimes we talk about, as an agent, we can't be an expert on everything. So knowing who to call often is as important as knowing what the problem is. So one of the tricks that you might see in this problem is oftentimes on these questions, the answer seems to be, who do you call if something comes up? Well, an attorney or a structural engineer or an accountant or something to that effect. Well, that's not the answer here. If you're dealing with environmental issues, you're going to reach out to a qualified environmental engineer, a specialist in the area. Now, that sounds so obvious when I say it that way, but look at what some of the off answers would be. In the event that there's a concern regarding an environmental hazard, who would you call? An attorney might be one of the possibilities that's on there. They might even say an environmental attorney, which is not a bad answer, but they're not specialists in determining whether a environmental issue is a problem or not. The EPA, again, not a bad answer, but they're not going to be the specialist. They might be able to give you the names of some specialists. So notice, who am I calling here? Qualified environmental engineer, specialist in that particular area. Brokers should be aware of the areas that they sell. However, you need to open up your investigations on this. For example, I sell in the Triangle area of North Carolina, and I'm often aware just simply because of the news. But think about this, if I go outside of my area, how am I going to know that in Cumberland County, there was an issue of chemical release, or in Chatham County, there were some phosphates that were in the water systems or something to that effect. So you need to know how to study it, where to find information on that. EPA or closing attorney may have some info, but they are not the best source of testing. Go back to what I mentioned in the first bullet point on that, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. Who do you call? You're going to call an environmental engineer, a specialist in that particular. At this point, we're going to start talking about some specific environmental concerns. The first one we're going to talk about is lead-based paint. Now, let me remind you, let's run it through the blender of what we described we're going to look at in any of these environmental hazards. We'll get to that in just a moment. Let's go with the list of what we have on the questions we have on the top of this slide. What are our duties with regards to lead-based paint? Let's assume that means what are the agent's duties regarding lead-based paint. So, for example, let me tell you what I mean on this. We're going to talk about the agent's duties. We're going to talk about the seller's duties. You're going to see that they're different things. So the agent's duties, we just want to make sure that the buyers and sellers are aware that if you're building a house built prior to 1978, and by the way, that's one of the bullet points right there that you want to make sure of in regards to studying lead-based paint. This only applies to houses that were built prior to 1978. Literally, if it was built December 31st, 1977, it falls under this act. After January 1st, 1978, it does not. So I'm showing or listing a house built prior to 1978. As an agent, I must make the seller aware of certain disclosures that they have to make. Now listen closely as I describe this disclosure to you. The seller provides a lead-based paint disclosure form. The questions that it asks on that disclosure form is, seller, are you aware of the presence of any lead-based paint? Most sellers would have no idea whether there was lead-based paint in the home. They may have heard something about it, and they may say, well, my house was built in 1954, so clearly it has lead-based paint. But that's not what the question is. The question is, are you aware of any lead-based paint? So in most cases, the seller is going to say, no, I'm not aware of the presence of any lead-based paint, and they're not lying to you, okay? If they are aware of the presence of lead-based paint, it probably means they've had it tested, and they would acknowledge that they are aware of the presence of lead-based paint if that was in fact the case. So the seller is required to provide the form. The agent is required to help the sellers understand that they need to, as part of the federal law, that they need to provide these forms. And if I'm a buyer's agent looking at this house built before 1978, I need to let the buyer know that they should receive this particular form. The law says that a buyer should receive this lead-based paint disclosure. So what are the agent's duties? To make the buyers and sellers aware of their rights and obligations under the Lead-Based Paint Act. What are some of the sources in regards to lead-based paint? For the most part, if you're dealing with lead-based paint, it's very, very possible that the paint that was used during the time, it had some great qualities, actually. Lead-based paint has some great qualities, and that's why it was used. And it could be used in different parts of the house. But lead also could be an issue in pipes as well. So it could be interior, exterior paint. It could, in fact, be plumbing fixtures and things like that. So the fact of the matter is, someone that's buying a home, especially if they have young children, they would want to be aware if there's a lead issue in regards to that house. Continuing on with the question of lead-based paint, let's talk specifically about the seller's obligations at this point. We mentioned one already, so please make a note of that if you didn't, that one of the seller's obligations in regards to lead-based paint, in other words, a house built prior to 1978, is to provide the disclosure statement. I will repeat what the question was. The question was, seller, are you aware of any lead-based paint? And I suggested they probably would not even know that unless they had had the house tested. The other thing that the seller is obligated to do under the Lead-Based Paint Act is they're required to provide the pamphlet that you see here, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. We actually have a copy of this in our documents on our study materials. You can go and look at that all you want to. The fact of the matter is it's created by the EPA. Sellers are going to have no idea where to get this. So for the most part, the agents will provide it to the seller so that they can make it part of the disclosures that they give to the buyer if they're selling a house built prior to 1978. So you have the disclosure statement, you have the pamphlet, and then the third thing that the seller is obligated to do for a buyer if their house is built prior to 1978 is provide that buyer with a 10-day risk assessment period. The buyer can waive this if they want to. The buyer doesn't have to do any testing in regards to lead-based paint, but the seller has to give them 10-day risk assessment period in regards to lead-based paint if the buyer chooses to do any assessments on the property. To wrap that up for you just real quickly, let's hit on those things that we talked about. What does the owner have to provide? The disclosure statement, the pamphlet, and a 10-day risk assessment period. Okay? Notice this second question. Must the owner certify that the home is lead-free? You know, sometimes on these environmental concerns, we scare you into believing that the seller has to do more than they have to. Look, here's the deal. The seller, if they do the three things that we talked about, can tell the buyer, either buy it or don't buy it. But the seller does not have to certify that the home is lead-free. It might make it more marketable if they were to do that, but the seller is not obligated to do that. Watch out for that on the test. Must the owner pay for the inspection? No. The fact of the matter is, if the buyer wants to inspect the property, then they should pay for the inspection. They don't have to, but if they choose to, it's the buyer who pays for that. This next question is a little bit interesting. On any topic, I try to do a drill down to 3 or 4 things that might be important. We're getting a little bit far in this one. Must the owner allow the tenant to inspect for lead? Notice that it allows me to say this. First of all, the lead-based paint rules apply to both purchases and to rental situations. However, the big difference is that in a tenant situation, they're usually only there for a short period of time. So the tenant doesn't have the same 10-day risk assessment period that a buyer would have on the property. If the tenant is concerned about lead-based paint, they could try to negotiate with the landlord and see if the landlord could produce an inspection regarding lead-based paint, but the law doesn't necessarily give them the same entitlement that a buyer would have. And the reason for that is lead builds up in the bloodstream over time, and so tenants are only going to be there for a modest period of time, typically speaking. They don't get all the same protections. Also, I want you to know that there are rules regarding lead-based paint remediation. It's important that you know these. I don't know how much detail that you need to know, but think about this. Houses that were built in 78 or prior to 78, at this point, they've probably gone through 1, 2, 3, depending on how old they are, could be more renovations. So there are rules about this. Think about this for just a moment. Lead-based paint is a problem in regards to getting it into your bloodstream. So how do kids get it into their bloodstream? Well, kids are notorious for touching things and then putting their fingers in their mouth. Okay, they're notorious for picking up things and putting them in their mouth like paint chips. They wouldn't even think about it. It might look like it's vanilla or something like that, so maybe they would do that. So if there's going to be remediation done regarding lead-based paint, then the people need to be certified if they're going to do this professionally. So if a person is doing a remediation on lead-based paint, they have to pass a certification. There are program courses for this. These are fairly easy to find online if you want more information. And the penalties can be pretty strict on this. Fines of as much as $750 per day for North Carolina and $32,500 federal. So in other words, if you're going to be doing remediation or renovation on a home that was built before 78, you need to be working with a certified painter, someone who's gone through these courses and is certified to handle this particular environmental threat. If you wonder why, think about this for just a moment. When paint is being scraped, it's creating dust. And again, the kids can get their fingers in it, put it in their mouth. That's why it's a problem. Or it could be paint chips. So there are handling procedures if you are dealing with lead-based paint. Interestingly enough, if you're a do-it-yourselfer, these rules don't really apply to you the way they would professionals who do have to be certified. I would like to point to one more thing before I leave this particular topic. Notice I keep saying kids. Now, lead-based paint, lead could be a problem for many people. But having said that, it's mainly a problem for kids. So I told you that in each one of these environmental concerns, one of the things that we want to talk about is what is the health problem and what is the remediation. So let's walk through that just real quickly, okay? The health concern associated with lead or lead-based paint in this particular case is potential neurological damage, damage to the central nervous system. If it is ingested, it can build up in the bloodstream over time, and it could in fact cause neurological damage. Now, why do I mention kids? Well, first of all, adults are not as likely to pick it up and put it in their mouths as a kid would be. But there's also another reason as well. Children specifically, they mention in the law, under the age of 6, their filtration systems are not quite as mature as an adult would be. So it's more problematic if they ingest it. They're smaller systems, their filtration is not quite as good, and so it can be more of a problem with kids than it can be adults. Having said that, I don't recommend that anyone ingest lead, but that's the problem. Okay, health concern, neurological damage. Children under the age of 6 are our main concern, and then throughout this, I've told you what the seller needs to do. Provide the disclosure, provide the pamphlet, provide a 10-day risk assessment period, and then house is built before 1978. Those are your bullet points on lead-based paint. That should cover pretty much any question that you come up with. Next bullet point, or the next environmental concern, is asbestos. Now, asbestos was used a lot. Interestingly enough, asbestos hasn't been used for residential purposes in a large way since 1978. It's a coincidence, it just happens to be the same time as lead-based paint. You will not be tested on a date for asbestos like you would on lead-based paint, though. In regards to asbestos, why was it used? It was actually a great material for certain things, had great fireproofing qualities. It also had great insulation qualities. So asbestos, you'll see it in ceiling tiles, you'll see it in floor tiles, sometimes siding on houses, sometimes in the roof you will see asbestos if the houses were built before 78. Insulation around piping in your house for like your plumbing and things like that. So you see asbestos a lot in older homes. However, interestingly enough, when we talk about asbestos, you want to focus on the word friable. Now, friable means crumbling, deteriorating, airborne asbestos. That's the problem with asbestos. Once it's airborne, it's a microscopic material, so you would not even notice that it's in the air. But when you breathe it in or ingest it, it could cause a major problem. It's a hook-like fiber, and unfortunately, when you ingest it or if you breathe it in, it can attach to the linings of your lungs or your stomach. You often hear asbestos talked about in relationship to mesothelioma. It's a big word. I don't know that you need to know it for the exam, but the main thing that you want to focus on asbestos as far as a health concern goes, the health concern associated with asbestos is lung cancer. Mesothelioma is a specific type of lung cancer. Technically, some stomach cancers could be related to this as well. So let's review again real quickly on asbestos. We know what the health concern is, lung cancer. Now, by the way, keep in mind when you're testing on this, they're going to put these environmental hazards side by side, and you have to know what the health concern is. Do you remember in lead-based paint, it was neurological damage. It wasn't so much cancer. But in asbestos, we're talking about cancer. So that in and of itself could actually be one of the ways they would test asbestos versus lead-based paint. So we know the health concern associated with asbestos is in fact cancer. Okay, and so then the question becomes what to do about it. Well, remember, asbestos is only a problem if it's friable. Okay, if it's crumbling, deteriorating, and airborne, that's the only time it's an issue. So asbestos that is intact, I would probably just leave it alone. If you do want to remove it, you would hire someone that has expertise in removing asbestos so that they would handle it appropriately as an environmental concern. Okay, if in fact you have friable asbestos, so let's picture this for just a moment. Let's assume that the insulation around your plumbing has been compromised. Good gosh, before 78, I mean, those houses are over 50 years old at this point. So some of these things are starting to deteriorate. One of the words that you see come up with asbestos is the idea of encapsulation. Encapsulation is exactly what it sounds like. You would take the compromised area, you would wrap it in such a way that it's not exposed to the air. So encapsulation is in fact a way that you could handle asbestos. You could leave it alone if it's intact, you could remove it, you could encapsulate it. That's the way you deal with asbestos. So now we know the health concern, and now we know the remediation process through encapsulation. There's some of the areas I mentioned that you would see the asbestos. Okay. Next environmental concern. The next environmental concern is radon. A couple of things that you need to know about radon. First of all, radon is a colorless, odorless gas. It derives from the decay of uranium and radium. Not so much important for test purposes. It's just a fact that that's where it comes from. And this decay is going on underground, and what it does is it seeps up through the pores of the earth. So take a look at the picture of our house there, and notice how radon can get into a home. So as it's getting into through some of the cracks and crevices of the house, it now is in an enclosed environment. So let's take a look at this real quickly. Radon. What is the health concern associated with radon? Radon is the second leading cause of lung cancer in the United States. Now, certainly, smoking cigarettes is probably at the top. Radon is the second leading cause of lung cancer in the United States. So this can be a scary topic, but don't let it be. So here's 2 points we know so far. Big deal. Second leading cause of lung cancer. Colorless, odorless. Okay, that's a big deal as well. And what I mean by colorless, odorless is when you walk into a house, you're not going to walk in and just simply say, wow, the radon's high in here today. You would never know unless there is a test. So now let's push it back to why you're here. As real estate agents, one of the things that we need to know is when we're looking at houses, we advise our clients to have certain tests. Hey, Mr. Buyer, I believe that you should probably have a radon test done in this area. Oh, how do you know, Chris? Has it been detected here? We have no way of knowing. The only way we know is to have a radon test done. Okay, so a radon test is done. And what they're trying to look at the radon test is whether there is the presence of greater than 4.0 picocuries per liter of air of radon in that particular home. The EPA has set a standard of 4.0 picocuries per liter of air, as anything above that would be potentially problematic if you're exposed at that level over a long period of time. Okay, so let's think about this again. We know the health concern is lung cancer. We know it's colorless, odorless, so we're going to have to test. And as agents, what is our duty? Our duty is to advise our clients to have that test. If they choose not to have that test, we need to document that they chose not to have that test. Now, there is only one bright side when it comes to radon. Radon dissipates harmlessly in open air. So if you leave your house pretty airy throughout the year, it's probably not going to be a problem because it's not going to build up in the interior of your house. But the way a lot of houses are built today, they're built to be so airtight for efficiency's sake. If the radon gets in, oftentimes it cannot escape. So this is a test that is very much worthwhile. Not going to be important on the exam, but the test probably costs $125 to $150 for a radon test. They're not dramatically expensive when you're buying a home. Now, here's the remediation of radon. I told you this would be interesting as well in all these questions. If you have radon in your house, the goal is to get the radon out of the house so it doesn't build up over time. And the way that this is done is through a ventilation system. So what's the remediation for radon? It's a ventilation system that can be put into houses, and what they do is they go down into the foundation of the house. They capture the gases, they run them out through the house through a ventilation system. These can run anywhere from a couple of $1,000 to $3,000. Again, don't quote me on that. My point is this is a problem that can in fact be cured with a little bit of effort, a little bit of money, okay? So radon, health concern, lung cancer, radon builds up over time. It's colorless, odorless, so you're not going to find it unless you test. So don't fall for any exam question that leads you to believe that it has a citrusy odor or some other type of foul odor or anything like that. You'll never know unless you test it. If you do test it, small cost. If you have to remediate it, modest cost, okay? But worth getting rid of radon if you have that in your house. That's the next health concern. Okay, now when it comes to mold, when you look at this slide here, I really don't have a whole lot to say about mold, other than the fact that if you have mold, you likely have another problem. You most likely have a moisture or a water problem. So when I go into a house and I see that there's mold, or more to the point, as an agent, when I walk in the house, oftentimes I can smell if it's musty, and it feels like it has that smell of moisture that's been present in the house for a period of time, it leads me to believe that there might be mold or mildew. Now, listen, different people have different exposures to mold and different responses to mold. And there are different types of molds. There are Stachybotrys molds, which are toxic molds, and you heard a lot about those years ago. I'm not saying that mold's not an issue. I'm saying that when it comes to mold, we need to have some more research here. So what are my red flags when it comes to mold? Well, you might be able to see it. But oftentimes, some of the more toxic molds, you would not even be able to see or recognize. They would have to be tested as well. But oftentimes, if there's a mold problem, not oftentimes, every time, if there's a mold problem, there is either a moisture problem now or has been a moisture problem in the past. My recommendation is let's figure out what the moisture problem is, fix that. Is it a leaking pipe? Is it standing water in the crawl space, et cetera, et cetera. That's how we're going to deal with mold. Underground storage tanks, let's just hit on those a little bit quickly. In the past, not so much anymore, but you occasionally still see this. But it was very common in the past that underground storage tanks would be where you could keep gas or your petroleum for heating your house. The problem with these underground storage tanks is, just like everything else, over time, they can deteriorate. And think about this. If in fact they are deteriorating, they can be leaking into the soil. If they're leaking into the soil, they could cause an environmental hazard to the water table, to your well, or something to that effect. So when it comes to underground storage tanks, let's think about this. The fact of the matter is, as an agent, if you know, or if you reasonably know that there's an underground storage tank, I promise you it is a material fact. This has to be disclosed. I don't care if you're the listing agent or the buyer's agent. Underground storage tanks have to be disclosed. They can be tested. Not all of them are going to be bad. They can be tested to find out whether there has been any compromised soils in the area. And if there have, they can be removed. They can be remediated. And what happens in these remediations, the tanks are removed, and then all the compromised soil is removed. Oftentimes when one of these projects starts, it can get extraordinarily expensive. And the reason for that is they have to keep removing the compromised soils until they get to a place where there's not compromised soils. And they don't know, even as they're quoting, how many truckloads of dirt that's going to be. So what do I want you to remember about underground storage tanks? It's a material fact. If you know, or if you reasonably should know. Oftentimes agents are not really talented about walking around houses to look for material facts. They're used to looking for material facts inside. But if you're walking around the house and you see a pipe sticking out of the ground, if I were you, I would ask questions about what that pipe is. Often that's an underground storage tank. If I'm walking around the house and there's a petroleum smell or a dark spot on the dirt where it looks like something has seeped, ask questions. It might be that there's something underneath that ground that you would be responsible for as a material fact as well. Underground storage tanks, clearly they're material, and the remediation on those is, if they're compromised, remove them and remove the compromised soil as well. If I'm a buyer, I want this done by the seller before I take possession of the property. That's why we want to know up front. Just a couple of FYI on this particular slide. Let me go ahead and get you the, if you ever see on the test Superfund or CERCLA, CERCLA stands for Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. The reason that these are created is to recognize that there are areas that were compromised by environmental concerns, and there has been some money that has been set aside to clean up certain of these sites. Like I say, as an agent, what's important to you is to find out if there is the potential for the environmental concern. If you believe that there's a potential for the environmental concern, you want it tested before closing, because you want the seller to be responsible for the remediation as opposed to your buyer taking the property subject to the environmental concern. There is some money available for cleanup. However, sometimes this is limited. Some of these have sunset, so you're not guaranteed this money. Even in commercial properties, oftentimes you'll hear commercial agents talk about doing tests. in regards to phase one, phase two environmental inspections. Phase one environmental inspection, basically, when you're talking commercial, a phase one environmental inspection is basically where they look at the history of the property. Was it ever used for any intensive use that might involve chemicals or things like that? Was there a dry cleanup facility there that might have been dumping chemicals? Was there a gas station there that might have compromised the soil? So that's the phase one. In the phase two, they're often doing borings into the soil to find out if there's any problems on that. By the time you get to phase three, it means there's going to be an expensive cleanup. All right, those apply to commercial. I don't know how much you would see those on the exam, but if you see environmental inspections, phase one, phase two, what they're doing is testing to find out if there are any environmental concerns on this property. All right, one that we can be very, very specific about: meth labs, bad. All right, if you're selling a house that was in the past used for a meth labs leave damage. Okay, the chemicals that are part of this process can get into the gypsum board in the walls. They can get into carpets. They can get into furniture and things like that. So if you know that you're selling a property that is being used as or has been used as a meth lab, then this is clearly a material fact. There are remediation processes for this. If the county is aware that a house was used as a meth lab, the sheriff's department would actually have a record of that, so you could check with that if you had any suspicion. Oftentimes in a neighborhood, the word would get around that it was a meth lab. If you have any way of knowing this, you need to make sure that your clients are aware of it. Absolutely material fact. And again, the remediation process is a thing. But if I were a buyer agent, I would want to make sure that the remediation was done, there was a record of it, and we could document the fact that it's now safe for someone to use after that point. The meth labs create toxic chemicals, which create a material fact. All right, as we're going through this, and I'll write some test questions for you on this as well, but I do in fact want to hit just a quick review as we're exiting this part of the chapter. So, review. A buyer has concerns about radon. He's heard in this particular area, or he's heard from his friends what a big deal it is. What would a reasonably prudent associated broker do? Now, if you want to, you're welcome to stop the video and write down some of your own answers on this, but I can tell you, what would a reasonably prudent associated broker do? You would highly recommend that they have a radon inspection done. And in regards to the radon inspection, there are very, very particular rules about this. There are radon inspectors out there that know exactly what needs to be done. There's a time frame associated with it, and this can be done for a modest amount of money. But if my buyer says, I have concerns about this, matter of fact, even if the buyer didn't say it, I'm recommending a radon test. Why? Because you can't detect it without a test, because it's colorless and odorless. A seller lists a 1920s home for sale by owner. A represented buyer wants to make an offer on the property. What would a reasonably prudent licensee recommend? Again, I'm looking at this particular house, and I know it was built in 1920. My buyer has small kids. They want to make an offer on the property. I'm going to lead them through several questions. First of all, clearly they're obviously going to want a home inspection. We didn't talk about it in this chapter, but hopefully you would know that you'd want to recommend a home inspection. And very specifically, you would want to recommend a lead-based paint inspection as well. Now, a lot of times, the buyers are going to say no to the lead-based paint inspection, and I kind of get it. The fact of the matter is, if the house has been painted several times, it's been well taken care of, I get it why sometimes a buyer would not want to do this. But if the house was built in the 1920s, a inspection, and this is probably going to cost you $500, $600, $700, okay, to get a lead-based paint inspection done. They're not inexpensive. But the fact of the matter is, as an agent, I'm going to recommend, buyer, you want to consider this. Oh, by the way, don't forget the pamphlet that the seller gave you. Read through that and see if it's a concern for you. We could have it tested. If we have it tested during the diligence phase and we find there's lead-based paint, we could always go back to the seller and say, what can you do to help us remediate this particular problem? So what would a reasonably prudent licensee recommend? As you take a look at the answer here, it's exactly what we said. I'm going to recommend that you get a copy of the disclosure, and also I'm going to recommend that you have any inspections done that might be of importance. I do want to mention two words to you before we leave this particular chapter and this slide. We've already talked a little bit about asbestos. If the buyer wants that inspected as well, they might want to have an air quality test or something to that to see if there's any friable asbestos in the property. A couple of things we have not mentioned in this chapter. Urea foam insulation. I'm not super concerned about this coming up on the exam because it falls under the syllabus dealing with the environmental concerns. I did want to at least mention it. Urea foam insulation. The problem with that is that a great example of this is, I don't know if you remember, after Katrina came through Louisiana, the big hurricane that happened years ago, FEMA took a bunch of trailers down to the area so that people would have temporary housing. Well, if you know much about Louisiana, it gets extraordinarily hot and it's very, very humid. And the problem was happening that in these trailers is that they would get hot, and on the inside, they would, some of the materials that are used inside the trailer, for example, the fake woods, the pressed woods and things like that, some of the furniture, some of the materials that they had, because of the way they were created, the manufacturing process, they had urea formaldehyde in them. And so what would happen is as they got hot, they would off-gas. If you were to get any question at all about this, it might have something to do with off-gassing. But what happens is when it heats, it creates this gas that comes out of these manufactured products. And that's what the concern here is with like the urea foam insulation as well. If it does off-gas, it creates an irritant. Now, fortunately, the urea formaldehyde has not been associated with cancer in humans. It has been associated with cancer in lab rats, but it doesn't translate to humans necessarily. But even if not, it is an irritant. So if you see a question having to do with urea formaldehyde or something like that, just understand that that isn't the environmental concern with that is it is an irritant. It can make you cough, it can make breathing a little more difficult, et cetera, et cetera. So I would add that down to the bottom of the list, but we hit some of the big ones. We hit lead-based paint, we hit radon, we hit asbestos, we hit underground storage tanks. Some really good stuff in this chapter. Very, very specific, so make sure you pick up yourself 1 to 3 questions in this particular chapter.